Thank you and welcome to another episode of Geek USA, an all things nerd podcast where the Trekkie meets the techie. My name is James.
And my name is Carl.
And this week, we're going to discuss Dream Theater's 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. All right, Carl, so this week we are talking about 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, Dream Theater's cleverly named 6th album. And I think for most fans, this record, it represents a turning point of sorts. I think there are a large contingency of fans that feel like this is the beginning of the end. And I feel like there's a large contingency of fans that feel like it's the beginning of the best, that was yet to come. Regardless of where you fall, I think it is universally regarded as an excellent album. Their first double disc, a concept album of sorts, and very much bridges the gap of everything they had done at the time, from their probably heaviest entries into their catalog down to some of the most sublime. What are your thoughts and initial impressions on 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence?
I might have said this at some point with like every one of our podcasts, but I gotta say this is probably my favorite record that they have. Sonically, it's this is, I think, the start of where, they've been very consistent as far as production from one end of an album to another. I think this is like the start of that for the most part. I maybe thought production on Octavarium was up and down, and there were some points, with scenes from a memory, Christ. But this one, I think, was probably the antithesis of like them and production. It sounds great. The songwriting's fantastic, and it is in and of itself is almost perfect. It's a 2-disc album done right, which is kind of rare in the world of 2-disc albums. So, my favorite, I think, and probably their best.
Yeah, we've definitely talked about, where we come out on the records, and it's always at the top. If it's not my favorite, it's in my top 3. And it is by far my favorite produced album of theirs. I feel like they did a very good job. At this point, I feel like starting with Falling Into Infinity, they had been working towards trying to figure out a way to give, Mike's drum set some punch and clarity so that he sat in the mix. In a lot of metal and rock albums, I feel like the way you make drums, stand out in the mix is you just make them louder. But they figured out a way to do that without just making them louder. And so this is kind of the perfection of his drum set and John Petrucci's guitar tone both sitting like right up front in the mix and very much complementing each other. And I think from just a production standpoint, if you turn this album up really loud, it's just a pleasure to listen to. John Petrucci's guitar tone had gone through some quite a bit of refinement, and at this point he had switched companies. He was using different amplification. He had kind of really dialed in on what he had been looking for, which was not a...
Yeah, he's fully integrated right now. Like on this album was 100% the New Music Man. So there was no...
Correct. He's using Mesa Boogies at this point. Everything had been kind of fine-tuned, and really what he had been looking for was something that was kind of not being done by... It wasn't the Envo guitar tone, and same with Mike Portnoy, not your typical heavy metal. There's punch to the kick drum, but there's also weight to it. It doesn't sound like he's got quarters on his beaters. He doesn't have that stereotypical metal drum sound. And then, of course, there's James Libri, who, while at the time... maybe live wasn't the most consistent singer, still had a beautiful voice in the recording studio, and they put it front and center. And very much for the first time, there was a lot of processing that was done in the mixing. So you had a lot of effects being applied, a lot of clever production tricks being done that I think, very much evoke what a lot of bands were doing in the 70s, especially with the vocals. So I was a big fan, and I think... Like I was saying earlier, I think this is the record that I've been most excited to talk about since we've been doing this podcast. So, Carl, give me your initial memory of this record.
My initial memory of this record. So I had seen them on the Scenes from a Memory tour. You and I both saw them, and it was probably like I think I kind of went backwards. Like I think like when Falling Into Infinity came out, I think was when my first kind of introduction to them was, and I went backwards, and then Scenes came out and I got that one, and I was really excited. And I didn't know what to expect from them. It's not like I was following the releases as it came out. As far as I knew, this was a band that did something very different every time that they made an album, and they just happened to be progressive for the most part. This was definitely it's kind of hard to say heaviest because Awake was very heavy. Awake has some production issues to it. This was probably the most sonically like loud, clear, and heavy sounding thing that they did. And I think my initial impression was like I didn't know that this band was ever going to do this heavy again. You know, I just thought that they were going to do the kind of the prog rock thing. And, you know, around this whole time that I was listening to them, you know, they kept sprinkling out these live performances, these demos from Falling Into Infinity. There wasn't really as much progressive metal going on with what they did as there was seemingly just progressive rock, you know. This was the straight up heavy, you know, for the most part. And unlike a lot of the other albums, you know, there wasn't really as much hit or miss on here, you know, save for some of the cheesy samples. But for the most part, I don't think there's a bad song on the whole album. So that was kind of my initial impressions of it. Do you know anybody who doesn't like this album? Like any Dream Theater fan who doesn't like 6 Degrees?
I very much feel like it is like a turning point album one way or the other for most fans.
Do you know anybody who doesn't like Scenes?
No, it's pretty universally loved.
I think these are the only two that I can think of where like, I mean, I've heard some people say like they weren't too big on Images. Like I think I've heard somebody, at least one person I've run into online or in person, say that there's ups and downs for what they do or don't like, except for this and Scenes from a Memory.
Well, and you touch upon an interesting point with the idea that it's heavy. So while they had already released a pretty heavy record in Awake, I feel like a lot had changed between 1994 and 1999 and 2000. And music had obviously gone through a major upheaval in regards to production techniques and what was considered heavy, especially in regards to like how music's recorded, had changed a lot. And I think John Petrucci especially, you know, from a guitar perspective, always seemed to be somewhat dialed into whatever was going on. You know, as detuning guitars and 7-string guitars, all of that was becoming more and more popular, he was finding a way to kind of embrace that and implement it into Dream Theater's music without necessarily like just changing everything they're doing. So, and I think that this record kind of updated that. So Awake was heavy in a very early 90s heavy metal sort of way. This record was heavy and not in a heavy metal sort of way, just like sonically just punched you in the face, but in all the right ways. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was kind of a way to because it had a more modern way of being kind of like a heavy album, you know, not just a bunch of like, you know, metal riffs and metal production, but it's not like a new metal sound either. You know, they kind of completely bypassed that. It seems like they just took who they were as a band and said, we're just going to make this heavier, maybe a little darker than the last two albums, and just kind of leave it at that. You're right. Awake does have like a kind of a stereotypical heavy metal sound. Like, you know, if somebody says like heavy metal, and, you know, if somebody were to parody it, you know, somebody was, you know, sit down with a guitar and let's just write a joke song and we'll make it a heavy metal song. I mean, that's kind of how it'll sound. It's just I'm not saying it is a joke. That's kind of a stereotype, like reverb, tight drums, you know, thick riffs, you know, thick bass. And that's kind of how it is, where this is different. It's very pristine. It winds up being very heavy with kind of like a dark color to it, but very clear. We're not overly reverbed out. There's some nuance to not just the playing, but there's nuance to the sounds. You know what I mean? So it's got to be one of the best produced albums I think I've ever heard. Like just in my entire collection of music that I own. Yeah,
no, I could not agree more. I guess I will, real quick before we dive into the record, I will recount my initial memories of it. I've talked about this a little bit on our previous Dream Theater podcast where we ran through the discography, but for those who haven't heard that, and it's a story worth retelling, I was working at a record store back in 2000 when this record was slated to come out, and I had a buddy that worked over at Best Buy, and I remember him walking in one day being like, hey, check out what I got. I got a copy of the new Dream Theater. So holy crap, like, how did you get that? Where did you get that? I don't know. I know somebody back of a truck, blah, blah, blah. So he had connections. So he handed me this disc, and he said, you need to put this in the player and just play the first track. I've never heard, it sounds like Meshuggah. And I was like thinking like, all right, dude, like, I mean, the last record was good, but Scenes from a Memory was a miles away from Meshuggah. So I put it in, and he was, I mean, probably 3 minutes into Glass Prison. I was just looking at him, and our jaws, and it was, there's nobody in the store. I'm cranking it. You know how records, you got speakers all along the ceiling. It was just such a cool experience, and I was so excited. And Carl, that was the longest shift of my life because I could not wait to get off of work. It was either that day or the day after that I had to go to a party. So I am assuming it was a New Year's Eve party that with my girlfriend at the time. So it must have been New Year's Eve. We go to the party, and we're sitting there, and I offered to go out and get libations for everybody. And I ended up driving around for probably 2.5 hours listening to this record. And when I got back, she nearly broke up with me. She was so upset because it was like after 1 a.m. and the party was almost over, and she wanted an explanation. And back in 2002, 2001, there was no cell phones, or at least I didn't have one. So there was no way to get a hold of me. If I left, the only way you were going to find out where I was when I came back. So, and that began my love affair with this record. So yeah, I remember that well. It had.
I'm actually surprised that you didn't get dumped. I probably would have dumped you.
So I know I've told that story before, but it's the God's honest truth that I'm driving around on New Year's Eve, nobody in sight, and I'm just cranking this. And the thing I will say is that I loved some records you love and then you kind of grow tired of, and other records you don't like, but they grow on you. I loved every second of 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. The very minute I listened to it, it was everything I thought I'd ever wanted to hear that I didn't know I wanted to hear. And I've never grown tired of it. I regularly listen to this record, probably every 2, 3, 4 months, and I have for the last 15 years. It is the epitome of what I think a good record sounds like. I love everything about it. Carl, real quick, I've been wanting to ask you this for a while. You talk a lot about mastering and kind of how stuff is hard to listen to and brick walling, and I know you're more sensitive, maybe even than I am, but I do appreciate your insights on it. Where do you think this comes out? Is it too loud? Was this ripe? Was this still at a point in time where it's loud but not overly loud?
And I think it's perfect. There's something about, and it's not a volume thing. I was like listening to King's X the last like couple days at work, and I know that right around like the ear candy period, Ty and Doug and the band they just generally weren't happy. I think the quote I read was they wanted the albums to kind of encapture what they sound like live, and then I listen to Ear Candy and I hear the guitars are thicker, but a lot of what I hear is you just made everything louder. And it's not a total volume thing because like I have to turn Ear Candy down to really kind of enjoy it, where maybe like the first 4 or so albums I can crank them really loud, and my ears don't kind of struggle to hear anything, and my it's not bombastic on my ears, but the total volume's probably louder. And that's kind of the same thing with Dream Theater. It's like I listen to everything up through here, and I can crank everything, and I don't feel like I'm hurting myself, and my ears don't have to try to struggle to adjust to hear things, because that's essentially what your ears do. Your ears adjust to the environment around you to pick things up. And when you go too far out of, when you try to do your ears' job for your ears, that's when stuff gets hard to listen to. And this is kind of like the pinnacle of, they found a way to make everything really loud and really heavy and really thick, but without really brickwalling things, without really messing with it. I can crank this album. Crazy loud and have a lot of fun listening to it. I probably can't get anything post Octavarium or between here and Octavarium. I probably can't do that with. Like I can't. The Train of Thought is close. It's a little thicker, but it's still pretty listenable. But you get to I don't know, the self-titled Dream Theater one, or the Dramatic Turn of Events, and I just think like if I turn this up too loud, it just sounds like crap, so
no, yeah, and it's unfortunate because especially when we were growing up, it was kind of always the beauty of buying a record, is that it sounded great, and then you knew when you could get someplace by yourself, when you could really crank it, it was going to become something else. And I feel like we've lost that a little bit.
But you get to like Systematic Chaos and Black Clouds. It's like everything's too loud even when I cut the volume in half.
Well, it's made to sound good through an iPhone speaker, through like a quarter-inch speaker as opposed to like a home stereo system. And that maybe more reflects that people are listening to music in different ways, but it is a shame that, and I feel like we've probably plateaued on that. It seems like now people are backing off or it's at least something that's talked about. I know a lot of metal bands, Iced Earth even recently, like they released the record and like they like put a disclaimer with it. Like John Schaefer was like, hey, this record is going to be softer than anything else you buy this year because I'm mastering this record the same way I would have mastered it in 1996. I have no interest in a brick-walled record. So before anybody says, this or that, and it was just, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea was sound. And I remember thinking, good for you, man. You're making a heavy metal record. I want that heavy metal record to sound as good as it can sound when I turn it up. And you know what?
Well, now, I mean, Metallica releases an album now, and fans immediately are trying to get a hold of raw tracks so they can master it themselves and put it on the internet because they're unlistenable. Yeah. What was it? Hardwired? There are some remasters of Hardwired came out in 2016, but there's versions of it that you can find on the internet that sound 5 times as good just because somebody with an ear, and not even just like, it's not even just an ear. I can recognize these things sonically and I don't necessarily know what the solution is, but there are some people who can do both and it's amazing. So yeah, it's kind of become a shame, but this album, 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, does not suffer from that at all.
So let's dive into this thing. I kind of want to go into the record track by track and get your thoughts and impressions. So to begin with, the title 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, when I got this promo of this, it was a burn disc. So I had no idea what the artwork was going to be. And when I saw the artwork, I remember thinking, that's pretty interesting. It's very artistic. It's not like any of their other record covers. And the title and the titles of the songs were intriguing to me. And I know that there was a little bit of information floating out before the album came out. The band had disclosed it was going to be a concept album of sorts with some loose themes dealing with mental illness, which I thought was, okay, cool. I'm not really sure how that'll work. But Scenes from a Memory worked. I trust them. And then I also remember thinking, double disc, okay, well, but on both points, I think they nail it and hit it out of the park. So, Carl, thoughts on the album cover, thoughts on the idea of doing a concept record on, dealing with mental illness. And while it's really just the main song that does, the whole album kind of has this. It's kind of more of a introspective record than maybe some of their other ones lyrically. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I think the album cover is my favorite that they have, only because to me it seems like there's like a real sense of art to it, whereas a lot of their other album covers, I mean, there's obviously art to it. I'm not ignorant to that, but it seems like they're taking some obvious just pictures and putting a picture on something, and this means this and that means that, which is cool. It's not uncool, but this to me just seems like it's just an interesting piece of artwork.
It looks like a Radiohead cover.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh God, I can't believe that's true. I just secondhand complimented Radiohead. Jeez. They were talking about, are they going to get in the Rock Hall on the first shot, and I just bulldoze the Rock Hall, please. But I love this album cover. To me, it's just a good looking piece of art to look at. As far as the double disc thing goes, the thing I love about this double disc effort was it's not like they said because they didn't we're going to put 80 minutes on both sides of it because we're going to maximize, we're just going to write stuff to fill up the time.
Exactly.
And they didn't do that. The first disc is like 55 minutes or something like that. The second one's like 45 minutes, and they're just interesting groupings of songs to listen to. It's like we get a regular Dream Theater album and then like a Dream Theater concept album, and we don't go overboard on like anything. We're not wasting space. We just didn't do 80 minutes on one side and give you 5 songs that are only okay. We gave you five songs that are amazing. Then we gave you however many tracks are on the second one's at 8. Then we gave you 8 songs. I don't consider it one song. If you wanted it to be one song, you should have made it one song. But the argument for the ages. But whatever.
I'm glad they didn't.
Yeah, I know.
So glad they didn't.
Well, I actually kind of go back and forth on that because like when I listen to Change of Seasons, I think to myself, if you would have split this up, I wouldn't want to. I want to listen to the whole thing, but the songs definitely have a start and an end to them, and I just think it kind of makes sense. But either way, it's a great 2-disc effort. You know, they're not wasting any time, they're not wasting any space, they're not trying to throw any really horrible tracks at you. So, double disc done right. You know, I don't think I could say that enough. We could probably do a podcast just talking about trying to find double discs that were done right, and it might take us an hour and a half. This is one of them.
It's a very small list, and this is on that list, and I completely concur with everything you've said. It is nearly impossible, I think, to make a double disc album that doesn't feel overly long and that wouldn't benefit from some editing. This record I would not change a second of. And it is a double disc album, but like you said, it's a double disc effort like Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans is. It's something that would have fit on vinyl on a traditional 4 LP set, you know, or a 2 LP set, depending on how you split it up. And I think that kind of format is kind of how I always think music works best. You know, about 45 minutes is really the max you're going to get on a piece of vinyl. And if you take 2 of those, you know, you got just a little bit under what the running time is on this. And I think that's a good, I know CDs can hold 80 minutes. I know now digitally you can make a record 7 hours if you want, but I've always felt that the 40 to 45 minute running time for an idea of music is so perfect and so succinct. And rarely do I feel like going beyond that works to the record's benefit. So without further ado, we're going to jump into this track by track. And Carl, the first track on the album, it's a keeper, The Glass Prison, which kind of kicks off. Not only does it begin what is going to be affectionately known as the 12-step suite, which basically is the idea that they're writing these songs and they're multi-part songs. And Mike Portnoy, who's basically taking the lyrics, he's taking the 12-step program. Mike, a recovering alcoholic himself, decided that, you know, it had meant so much to him, the 12-step program, that he kind of wanted to evoke the idea of each step with a lyrical contribution. And the idea, I don't know that they had planned, they knew that they were going to keep it going, but I don't know that they had any idea what the music was going to be. But this first edition, The Glass Prison, is the idea that we're going to write a colossal, monolithic heavy metal track to start off our record. And it was inspired by John Petrucci and Mike Portnoy going to a Pantera concert shortly before the sessions for the record were to begin, standing there and both looking at each other and saying, we need to do something like this. And it was the Reinventing the Steel tour, if those who remember that they actually went and saw. And, you know, that was the last Pantera tour. So thank God they caught it. And I think the idea to make something heavy, but heavy in a Dream Theater way, is very much on display here. And the other thing I will note is that the song is the beginning of what I affectionately like to know as Jordan Rudess's I don't know what to do here, so I'm just going to hit all the buttons at the same time phase. Because the song has all kinds of, like, it has police sirens, it has like weird scratching turntables things. It doesn't matter. The song's so amazing that even his hokey keyboard effects don't ruin it, but it does feel like, what am I supposed to play? I will just blindly hit stuff. I'm going to cover my eyes and just like tap things on the keyboard because I don't know what to do. Because like he's a keyboard player. What do you do on a track so heavy? There's no place for it. And I think he figures it out later on some of the other records. But on this record, he did seem out of place a little bit here and there. But I'll be honest, Carl, for a song so heavy, there's so much clarity. Everything sounds amazing. Give me your thoughts on The Glass Prison.
The Glass Prison was, when I first heard the track, is obviously the opening track of the album, I thought to myself, holy shit. And I just kept thinking to myself, holy, like every step was like, holy shit, holy shit, holy shit, until Jordan Rudess starts playing. And then I'm like, huh. That's confusing. And it's not that he's a bad player, but this is the, I've probably said this on every one of these that we've done post Kevin Moore, but this is exactly the spot where you start missing a guy like Kevin Moore, because I think Kevin Moore would really know what to do on heavy stuff.
Like the intro to Caught in a Web, right? I'm just going to play two notes. It's going to be perfect.
Without having to resort to trying to do a turntable thing on his keyboard. You know, he might have done samples like the Siren thing, but I think that he would have known, I think, a little bit better how to do the ambiance here. That being said, you would really miss a guy like Jordan Rudess once you get to disc 2, and obviously we'll touch on that later. I don't want anybody to think that I'm having a Jordan Rudess dump fest here. I almost kind of wish they would have just employed both of them. It just on the stage at the same time.
Well,
but
I've actually grown very fond of the parts. I agree with you. Like his like it's a very syrupy like lead tone that he uses that I don't know that fits, but I wouldn't change a thing on the record now. I like his playing. I do feel, and I know he has said this in interviews, that he just it seems like he didn't know what to do, and it just makes me laugh, but it's in a good-natured way. It's not like I feel like I can't stand that he's playing on here. And let's just be frank.
No, absolutely
The instrumental breaks and the interplay between him and Petrucci, it becomes apparent, especially on this record, that kind of stuff was never going to be possible with anybody else. So if John Petrucci was looking for somebody to push him musically, he found his match in Jordan Rudess, because
Absolutely.
Jordan Rudess is every bit as accomplished a pianist as John Petrucci is a guitarist, and it is breathtaking. And while I will say on later records it gets a bit old, this is kind of the first time you're hearing it, and it was so amazing and refreshing. The first solo, about 2 minutes in, that John Petrucci takes, it took me a year and a half to be able to play that along with the record. I practiced that. I have probably played that solo a million times because it's just the most complicated. And at that point in time, I remember thinking, I don't know that a human being can play faster. And of course, we'll find out in the next record that of course you can. Just give me a couple years to to get my metronome going. But Carl, it just blows my mind. And it still does. And that's why I like the record so much. James LaBrie sounds great on this song. The Mike Portnoy interplay between him and, James, I think works for the most part. I actually really like the lyrics. Talk to me about the 12-step idea. What are your thoughts on the lyrical content, and do you think that Mike nails it?
Yeah, I think that just to touch on the keyboard thing one more time, I think it's really easy, and I do this online, I do this with my opinions here. It's really easy to say the noodling thing gets old. It really is, because we've had Jordan Rudess for how many albums? Conversely, we only had Kevin Moore for a couple, right? Had we had Kevin Moore this whole time, you might hear me saying by now, all right, Kevin, it's great. You're moody, you're the dark artist, I get it. Okay, can you try something else? We might be saying the same
point.
It's very possible. I mean, the whole dark and brooding, and none of this is, it's a prog metal band, right? They're going to do the thing that they do to the nine. That's just what prog metal bands do. So, I might, dump a couple times on Rudess, but I love the guy and I love his playing, and I do think he's fantastic. As far as your question there, the lyrics of the 12-step thing, I think the hardest thing to write with lyrics is to write something that moves you. To even have something to say is really hard. I'm a very dispassionate person. I don't have anything to say beyond what we're doing now, and I find just the worst part about writing lyrics is to have anything to say at all. And then of course you take what you have to say and then you have an artistic style. Maybe you're really metaphorical, maybe you're really literal, maybe you're kind of in between. You could be a Brad Paisley or a Lane Staley, and it's or a Bob Seger, right? To take something that kind of is so personal to you and that means something to you, I don't think this is the kind of thing that a lot of people ever want to kind of talk more about. I've known some addicts, and then I've known some addicts who've we'll talk about that kind of a thing, but I don't think I know too many addicts that want to talk about it. Even when it's all over, I think a lot of addicts will, but I mean, who wants to? Maybe you went through the program and it's good, and you kind of do it every day, and maybe it works for you, but to kind of be able to just talk, to write so many lyrics about it and to kind of want to expand on that, I think is pretty great. And to kind of share that with people who are going to be listening, I think is fantastic. And, you might hear guys like Zach Wilde who say that it's kind of a silly idea and who needs a program like that. But, you might have a lot of people listening who think to themselves, hey, if it works for this guy, maybe it can work for me. And I think it's a great thing. And as far as the actual lyrics themselves, I think they're fantastic. So lyrically, The Glass Prison, I think, nails it. And of course, musically, it just kind of punches you in the jaw. So really good effort. Probably one of the best opening tracks I think they have as a band.
Yeah, it's right up there. And I just to kind of finish up on the lyrics, I feel like Mike Portnoy, it's difficult to do this type of subject matter without coming off as preachy or on the other, or like a victim, or there's just a lot of ways it can come across wrong. It's a very difficult thing, and I commend him. I don't know that every entry in the 12-step suite I think is a home run, but this one is. And lyrically, it's like the perfect tone. It really touched me at the time. It still does. It's a very confessional thing, but it's almost like a catharsis for him that I think he's living through the music. And I give him a lot of credit. I think that's very artistically difficult to do, like you said. And not only that, but he carries this kind of idea throughout 13 minutes of music, and it all kind of unifies together, even though there's not a lot of repetition. There's not a huge, big sing-along chorus you get to come back to 7 times. And for James's effort, I think he really kind of nails it. And this is kind of one of those things, like there's at the end of the song, the final like kind of climax that James is doing vocally, right before the glass shatters, there's almost like the way he's singing it, his voice, it's almost dripping with like it's almost like he's wailing. Like it just feels so emotive. And I always thought to myself, it was such an incredible thing that this guy's taking this other man's story and then being able to translate it in such a convincing way that I wouldn't, if you had told me James wrote the lyrics, I would have, believed you. And that's of course the idea, but God, they just nail it. And then to that point, the next track, Blind Faith, another super intense song, actually features a lyrical contribution from James. And, Carl, when this record was getting ready to come out, I remember calling you around Christmas of that year and being like, dude, on Dream Theater's website, they got these like clips, and you jump on your dial-up modem, and 17 minutes later it was able to like download this QuickTime thing of a 30-second clip. And I think they released 4 or 5 of these clips of them in the studio, and one of the clips was the intro to Blind Faith, Jordan and John Myung like kind of playing their separate parts, and like I was hooked. I knew the record was going to be good because that sounded so cool and atmospheric. And so, whereas maybe Jordan didn't feel like he had a fit so much on Glass Prison, he owns Blind Faith. This is a Jordan Rudess song through and through. It's very piano driven. It feels like an Elton John song on steroids. A beautiful lyric from James Labrie, a beautiful vocal performance, and the final 2-minute solo section at the end, it might be my favorite thing Dream Theater's ever recorded. It's not my favorite song, but just the whole instrumental section is so perfect. The drums, the fills, the guitar, everything dropping out, and you have this like classical piano interlude. I love Blind Faith. Tell me about this song.
Yeah, and to kind of just touch on what you were saying about Labrie, he's kind of a rare talent in that way, where he can he's just kind of ways of switching gears emotively when singing a tune. And, an opera or theater background will really do that for you, and he applies that really well to the Glass Prison, and he applies it really well to Blind Faith too. I mean, he kind of switches gears a little bit there. Very much, Jordan's never going to bring atmosphere as well as a guy like Kevin Moore, but he does bring atmosphere really well here. The way him, and kind of him and Myung here do a really good job of not just playing their parts, but kind of establishing a mood with the tune all the way through, like you said, that last 2-minute thing. And it's 2 minutes of this instrumental thing at the end, but it's not really pretentious, it's a 10-minute long song, but it really doesn't feel like a 10-minute long song, Great Debate feels 13 minutes. This just kind of feels like a really solid tune from one end to the other. So, wonderful piece of music. And yeah, like you said, you kind of, if you were to listen to this for 30 seconds, I think that you're going to get a good idea that whatever album that this 30 seconds was going to be put on was going to be amazing. But you're right. The download times back then weren't super fantastic, at least not in my house.
Do you remember that? Do you remember like me calling you and being so excited about it, or?
Yeah, but I remember not having anything except really shitty computer speakers, and we're talking about the ones that connected to the side of your CRT monitor. Mm-hmm. Like the big photon cannon, spewing light rays at you, and it was so hard to record with these two because if your guitar was facing the monitor, it was just picking up noise, and it would just record like this extra static that wasn't like amp static. It would just record all this extra noise. So you had to like turn away from the monitor when you played the part, put the guitar down, and do your editing. It was bad days. I can't when when those CRT monitors went the way of the dodo, it was good. It was good for technology. But yeah, I remember that, and I couldn't tell much from it except from your reaction, to be frank with you.
Well, I was excited, and at this point in the record, you've got two, quasi epics that I think really encompass the entire scope of Dream Theater, from the gentle kind of piano parts in Blind Faith to the aggressive, like super heavy sections of Glass Prison. It was like they had taken the boundaries of what they were capable of doing and just push them out in both directions. And then you get a track like Misunderstood, track 3, which very much reminds me of 10 Years Gone, the Led Zeppelin song, which happens to be my favorite Led Zeppelin song. They both feature kind of a D major riff kind of starting it off, which it was reminiscent. So they had me hooked from the first like notes of Misunderstood. I was like, oh, so this is going to be like that kind of song. John Petrucci writes the lyrics. It's, again, a 9-minute song that doesn't feel overly long. I know there's a lot of debate. The song has an extended outro with people are like, oh, I love the song except for the last 2 minutes. I actually think it works. It kind of all ties into the record. But again, one of John Petrucci's, in my opinion, best lyrics. I think this song lyrically it might be his best lyric. It's definitely up there for me. It's such a perfectly beautiful written lyric. I know that he had talked, he doesn't disclose a lot when he writes. I know the idea had been that, oh, this is about Jesus Christ, or this is about a performer, or this is about John Petrucci. It applies to so many things, but the idea of essentially somebody being on a stage and the thoughts of, alienation, I think resonate. The song is a epic, beautiful power ballad without coming off cheesy. It sounds like something Chevelle would write. Like it sounded like a modern band, but with so much more intricacy. And I love the freaking backwards guitar solo. Carl, what are your thoughts on Misunderstood?
Very nuanced song that I have yet to hear a version live that I think worked really, really, really well.
No.
And I don't know why that is, because when I listen to it, it doesn't seem like it's so production heavy a tune that like it can't work. Maybe just some songs don't translate well, but as far as on the album, it's an amazing track. The lyrics are fantastic. The overall mood of it's kind of creepy until you kind of get to the chorus, and then it kind of has like just like a little more of like an upbeat, tonality to it, and then it gets creepy again, and then kind of finishes, back to the upbeat, and then finishes kind of creepy. So it's a great track. They don't have a lot of songs like this, especially since, like a lot of songs that are in, and this and also kind of Disappear kind of go hand in hand into that whole, we're going to make something creepy. We're not going to ruin it with any noodling or anything like that. So it's kind of unique for them. Have you heard, is there one live version of this that you've heard that you thought was amazing?
No, it's difficult to recreate the atmosphere, though. I will say this track, and again, this is a compliment to Jordan Rudess, he very much evokes that kind of artistic, atmospheric thing that Kevin Moore was so good at doing. And this song could have been in the middle of Awake. I mean, it works. Everything they're doing here, it feels like every note is in the right place. And so I really feel like because of the way the song is recorded and mixed, it isn't necessarily meant to be something that's going to crush live. Or I think the mistake sometimes Dream Theater makes, that not that I should be telling them what to do live, but sometimes when you record something, you record it and it just is what it is, and it's its own thing. And then when you play it live, it becomes something else, if you know what I mean. Bands that remind me, like, so the Smashing Pumpkins are a really good example. They often had...
Yeah, they're an amazing example of this. I don't think any of their catalog live sounds like they did when they played it on the album. No, but it's great.
They often played Disarm as like a sludgy, like basically Disarm live, like with the guitars plugged in, sounded like something you would have heard on a Failure record. But then when they recorded it, they decided to just make it an acoustic guitar and cello. I just think Billy Corgan always kind of had this way of, like, the song is a song, and every time we play it, we're just capturing, it's like reading a poem. You're just capturing a different moment in time with it. And he was all about playing with, well, I wrote that 2 years ago, but this is how I feel like it should sound now. And they were always this organic kind of thing. And the record was simply the picture that was taken in that moment. And I feel like this is a good example of that. The Misunderstood could be done a different way. And the band has done that a little bit in recent years. They've kind of, like when they were playing Space Divest a couple years back, they kind of changed the way it's played, and I think it worked. And it wouldn't have worked any other way, if that makes sense. But no, I
Absolutely.
don't
No, I know
think
what you mean.
this doesn't translate live, but I do think that it works incredibly well on the record and is a great third track. Carl, let's talk about the Great Debate. Let's talk about the Great Debate. So, the Great Debate, to me, was the head scratcher when I first heard it. I now think it's genius, but a very long intro and there's probably 4 minutes of fading in and fading out, sandwiching a 10-minute long song that has some of the band's heaviest, most crushing riffs, very Tool-esque, the way it's put together. A very interesting arrangement. And then lyrically, John Petrucci, where Misunderstood, I felt like was this beautiful, very like personal thing. The Great Debate begins what I think is going to become something you see more of on Dream Theater Records. John Petrucci decides to just tell a politicized, unpoliticized kind of story. He basically takes the idea of stem cell research and gives you both sides of the argument. And unfortunately, while the record might have sounded cool in 2002 when it was released, it's kind of a dated idea, and that's always the danger, I think, with doing these kind of political, lyrical contributions. Though, I think what made it work for me was back in the day, I thought, God, those lyrics are so cheesy. I hate the song. And then I read on a forum somewhere somebody was like, no, man, it's great. It's like something Neil Peart would have written in Rush. And then I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, Rush has a lot of lyrics. Like, oh, I love Rush. This is cool. And then I just got over it. Because I think I needed to see, like, where he was coming from. But the song itself, independent of that, features some of the most processing you've ever heard on Labríe's vocals. It's heavy. It's industrial at times. It's grooving. It's unlike anything they've done in their back catalog. Carl, I love this song. I love the cheesy synth patches that Jordan Rudess puts on top. I think it all works super well. What are your thoughts on the Great Debate?
It's my favorite track on the album, I think, between both discs.
Are you freaking serious?
I mean, it's close between this and Glass Prison, but it's this one kind of takes it for me. I don't look at this as like a political tune. I mean, I classically can't stand listening to songs with politics in it. Not that that's a bad thing. Whatever speaks to you, but I get enough politics with what, my day-to-day that I just don't want to when I listen to music. To me, this whole thing about the stem cells, it's a very existential issue to me. I think it's kind of universally existential because, when you talk about different ways of creating life, I think it just kind of comes to that. And there's politics involved, banning doctors from doing this, that, or the other, allowing doctors and blah, blah, blah. I mean, politics will always be involved in something, but I don't hear a lot of politicking. That's not a word, but I don't hear a lot of that in this tune. I hear a lot of what ifs. What if we did this and what if we didn't? And to me, it kind of makes it a lot more interesting to listen to. And maybe I'm lying to myself. Maybe it is a political song and I just like it so much and I'm trying to find reasons to ignore that. But to me, I hear an existential conversation and I love those. But aside from the lyrics, it's not the heaviest tune on the album, but it comes really close to. I mean, the riffs in here are fantastic, and you can maybe say there's a little too much soloing in it, maybe a little redundant, but I've heard that and I've heard the case for that, and I can't necessarily say anybody who comes to that conclusion is wrong. I don't think so. I think it's perfectly paced and has kind of the right amount of noodling and the right amount of riffage and the right amount of lyrics. And geez, Labrie singing on this is fantastic. I don't think it gets too much better than this. This might be like one of my top 10 favorite songs that they have, but also it's definitely my favorite on this album.
Well, it definitely, and I think politic might have been the wrong word. I think what I meant is that it's a topical. It's not a song about his girlfriend or his love life or his past. It's not an introspective song. It's he's talking about the world around him in a very clinical way, and I think that when I view it through that lens, through that kind of Rush lens, it makes sense to me. And you're right. I remember at the time, 9/11 had kind of just happened a few months before this came out, and it was a really weird time, and especially I was 20 years old. I vividly remember it. It wasn't like I was a kid in school, so it was a very, very weird time to be alive in America. There was a lot of conflicting emotions and fear. And the thing that I remember thinking when I would listen to the song is the lyrics very much felt like they almost could be applied to, obviously like you have the constant saying of ground zero and stuff like that. And I remember I've read about this, and I think the Wikipedia page corroborates this, that the original title for the song was going to be called Conflict at Ground Zero. And they actually changed it at the last second because they were mixing the record when 9/11 happened. And they were like, whoa, so it was happenstance, purely happenstance. But it's a very interesting thing that, the great debate and kind of, taking the stem cell part aside, you could apply it to a lot of ideas that have kind of divided society and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And who would have guessed at the time that it would still be something 16 years later that is just as much of a debate now as it was then, and maybe more so as our technology is becoming more advanced. Do you have thoughts on, up to this point, we've got these 4 songs in a row. This opening salvo, do you feel like there's a Dream Theater record that gives you 4 songs in a row to start off a record as good as these 4 songs?
Can you phrase that question to me one more time? Because I don't think I quite heard you right.
This just as an opening salvo for a record. This record is about halfway done at this point. You've heard about 45 minutes of music. Is there a better first half of an album in Dream Theater's catalog? Because I really don't think there is. I think I struggle to think about these 4 songs. I wouldn't change a second of them, and I feel like you get a little something of everything all the way through. And I really, whether it's images and words, whatever it is, I feel like there's this is probably the only time I can think the band has just for 45 minutes never let up. Everything feels perfect.
I think it kind of depends on how we're saying never let up, because when I think about like the first half of Images and Words, I don't think that they're letting up either, and I think that they're doing 2 very different things.
Gotcha. Well, it's in the mix.
Awake in the first half has Silent Man, and I could take or leave it.
Yep.
There's a clunker or 2 in the first half of Falling. I could do without Through Her Eyes, but I got it. I mean, there's no first half of their album, any of their albums that I like as much as this one. I think that this is maybe the most varied. It's kind of heavy and moody, and it gets a little light. There isn't anything on here that reminds me of the first half of Images. So again, I think that they're doing 2 very different things. But I gotta say, if you were to ask me to take like a first half, I'm absolutely going to take the first half of 6 Degrees easy.
And the final track on the first disc is the track Disappear, which was, again, features lyrics written by James Labrie. I know Mike Portnoy at the time discussed they had this song and they were working on it quite a bit. And the issue they were having is they were trying to figure out a way to record the song to not make it feel like just a stereotypical power ballad. So the band, and I know Radiohead at the time, Mike Portnoy was a huge fan of Radiohead, and I know this was that was his touchstone. Let's do something like they would have done on OK Computer. And the song very much evokes that feel. James Labrie's lyric on this song is nothing short of beautiful. Like, it is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. Addressing the topic or the idea of like losing somebody, I'm just not sure that I've ever heard it more eloquently said. The song is beautiful. His vocal is beautiful. I love the atmosphere on it. And I know a lot of people, when I read about this record on forums, a lot of people cite this as maybe a low point on the record, but I think it's perfect. And I can't think of a better way to close out this first disc than this song. Carl, what are your thoughts on Disappear?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, everybody's got a different taste. I think that this is an amazing way to close out the album. I've always liked this track. It's dark and it's moody in a very really early, like maybe something they would have done on Awake. This track here is probably the only one on this collection of tunes that I think, I really could picture this on Awake. Mm-hmm. You could switch out Space Dyed Vest with this on each album, and I think it was an awesome way to close an album. So I think Disappear is fantastic, and they don't. Here's the nice thing about this is, and they're almost never going to do this the rest of their career, but they don't overdo anything on it. They do this track, and it just kind of is what it is, and they don't really do anything Dream Theater-y on it. It's kind of just, this is the track. It's going to be moody. It's going to be a ballad. It's not quite a power ballad, but it does kind of have a big build up to it, and then it just kind of ends. And it does it in a very artistic fashion. In a very tasteful way. So I don't think that there's a better way to close out the album. You maybe could say, let's flip Disappear and The Great Debate and close the album out with like, with kind of like with a big bang. And I think that would have worked too. Maybe Disappear right after Misunderstood wouldn't have worked though. So I don't know, but I think it's great. I know a lot of people don't like the track, but that's cool. More for me.
Yeah, no. And so that concludes kind of I think it'll be the first half of this podcast and the first half of this record. So Carl, are you ready to dive into the second half of 6 Degrees, the single track? Thank you for listening to another episode of Geek USA. Follow us on Twitter at geekusa_podcast and email us at geekusapodcast@gmail.com.